Hello, and welcome to Federal Jobs Data Unlocked, sponsored by CARO, the Center for Applied Research on Work at Cornell University's School of Industrial Labor Relations. My name is Anne DeCecco. I'm a Senior Research and Policy Development Associate at CARO, and I'm very pleased to kick off today's webinar. We have a very important topic today. Across the US, policymakers, organizational leaders, and researchers, to name a few, rely on publicly available federal data sources to inform things like public policy, business decisions, and programmatic resource allocation. Everyday people rely on official statistics too for life decisions, like what to study or where to move. Quality data that is objective and impartial is a public good that is key to a healthy democracy. It is information infrastructure, like roads and bridges are transportation infrastructure. At times, however, we may take our federal data for granted. It requires careful planning, maintenance, and modernization to keep it robust and relevant in the 21st century. Today, we'll look at the trajectory of the US federal data system with a particular focus on its labor and employment data, as well as threats and opportunities related to it and what we can do to bolster and protect these critical resources. Bringing evidence and analysis to bear in addressing questions like these are at the core of CARO's mission. We seek to leverage applied research conducted at the ILR school and partner institutions with the goal of informing policy and practice related to work, labor, and employment. CARO supports innovative research exploring difficult problems and finding novel solutions. Through our seed grants, faculty affiliate program, policy lab, Yangtan Workability Incubator, and member institutes, CARO promotes interdisciplinary collaborations, provides rapid resources to investigate issues in real time, and creates opportunities to share that research. Before we get started, I want to encourage you all to be active participants and enter questions as we go along into the Q&A box. We'll save some time at the end to make sure we can address as many as possible. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Erica Groshin. Dr. Groshin is Senior Economics Advisor at the Cornell ILR School. From 2013 to 2017, she served as the 14th Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the principal federal agency responsible for measuring labor market activity, working conditions, and inflation. Before that, she was Vice President in the Research and Statistics Group of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Her research is centered on jobless recoveries, wage rigidity and dispersion, and the role of employers in the labor market. So without further ado, I will now turn the mic over to Dr. Groshin to get us started and introduce our panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anne, for sponsoring this event. So I'm here to talk about federal jobs data. And I'm joined today by three distinguished fellow panelists. Steve Pearson, who is Director of Science Policy at the American Statistical Association. Jacqueline Kennedy, who's Director of New York City Labor Market Information Service, the LMIS, at the CUNY Graduate Center. And Wendy Kozlowski, Director of the Research and Open Scholarship at the Cornell University Library. So we're going to be talking about labor market data, kind of the big picture. How does it all fit together? What are the challenges? What's the future? Particularly to inform users both of how to think about it and what, frankly, they should be worrying about. Okay, so I'm going to just to launch things off. I'm going to set the ground. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of data and things like that, and then I'm going to introduce the panelists. All right, so this is the title: Federal Jobs Data Unlocked, Uses, Processes, Critical Infrastructure. So I'll start off really basic. This cute fellow here is William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, and he once said in much more flowery terms, the modern version of it is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. He was the guy who invented the Kelvin thermometer system, temperature system is named after him. He was all into measurement. And his point is basically that if we want to have evidence-based decisions, we need to have evidence. and that means measurement. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which I headed up for 4 fun years, was established in 1884. And it's, I think, interesting to realize that that was a time of pretty extreme industrial turmoil. And the issues were, kind of resonate with what's with today. There was a lot of technological change. There was increasing trade. There were worries about immigration, and there was the growth of unionization during that time. And so the policymakers, in their wisdom, decided that we would be one step closer to industrial peace if the two, if the participants in all this turmoil could be working from a common set of facts. And so they established the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And as Anne said, the BLS is the principal federal agency responsible for measuring labor market activities, working conditions, price changes. And the idea is that this is an agency of about 2,500 people that collects, analyzes, and disseminates essential information. And it's all in service of public and private decision making. And what's quite interesting about it is that while in the beginning, the known uses of the data were really focused on labor market needs, the availability of the data has fostered uses far beyond what the original creators of the BLS would have thought. So, for example, monetary policy today is based really strongly on the data produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that was not collected for that purpose to begin with. All right, so a principle underlying these data is that we're talking about just the facts and giving them to everyone. So this is a slide I showed a lot when I was a BLS commissioner. Here you have the glass of water, and people would say, is this glass half full or glass half empty? And then I would say, well, the BLS answer is neither of those. It is to say, this is a 12-ounce glass with 6 ounces of liquid in it. And that is the role of the statistical agency. People are fighting about whether it's half full, half empty, and the BLS can at least say it's a 12-ounce glass with 6 ounces of liquid, right? And it provides that to everybody, not to just a privileged few. So trust is mission critical for statistical agencies and you as users of the data. If you think about it, if you're going to use this information to guide some of your most important decisions, then you have to trust that the data are accurate and that they're objective. So that's very important, the trust of the data users. But it's also very important that the data subjects and the data providers trust the statistical system, that the data are going to be used to serve a very important need, otherwise why bother, and that the data are not going to be used to harm them individually and be held securely. So trust is mission critical. Without this kind of trust, you can't fulfill the mission of the statistical agencies. And as Anne said, data systems are infrastructure. They support enterprises, democratic society. They facilitate movement of goods. And like our infrastructure, they need an upgrade. So we'll talk about that. So just to round things out, BLS, how does BLS get its data? It conducts household surveys. Now, those it designs, but mostly it doesn't actually field them. They are mostly fielded by the Census Bureau, which they're kind of the gurus of the household survey in the federal system. So BLS designs and analyzes household surveys, and it conducts for itself many establishment surveys, going out to companies and asking them for important information about jobs and prices. And to do that, it has many collection modes, and participation actually both in the household surveys and the establishment surveys, is voluntary. So you really have to convince people to participate. The response rates that they get are much better than private surveys, but they are falling. And then there's growing use of administrative and non-survey data. The most important of these for the BLS right now are unemployment insurance employer records. But there's also web scraping, third-party sources, corporate dumps, things like that. So to just run through, one of the things you'll be hearing about today is the current population survey. This is kind of the premier household survey at the BLS, and it's about 60,000 households. It records labor market activity of those people. And the response rate right now is down to about 69%. Let me skip this one, but this survey is the source of the unemployment rate that we've been measuring from 1940 up to 2025. And this gives us our picture of what the economic conditions have been for that long period of time in a way that's comparable over time. Establishment surveys, the one you'll hear a lot about is the payroll survey that comes out along with the unemployment rate, comes out the first Friday of every month. This surveys works over 600,000 work sites that cover about a third of non-farm jobs. It doesn't ask a lot of information, but it gets it in a very timely way. The number of jobs, hours and earnings in the pay period containing the 12th of the month. And this one, the response rate is down to 43%. There's also the job openings and labor market survey, JOLTS. It's similar in many ways to the CES, to the payroll survey. It records job postings, separations, and hires over the month. It's a much smaller survey, though. It doesn't go out to nearly as many companies. Yes, and the response rate there is 34%, even worse. Okay, the sample frame for both of those surveys is from administrative data. This is the UI information that we talked about. The quarterly reports that are filed by all employers with state they file them to their state unemployment insurance offices. This covers 95% of jobs, so the coverage is huge. It records number of jobs, total quarterly earnings of all of the employees in the establishment on this quarterly basis, and it has basically just industry and location at the moment. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to mention a couple of other things and say that these data people have gotten very used to having them, and without the data, people will still have to make the decisions, and they will clutch at whatever they can find. And that is kind of worrisome when sometimes you don't know the provenance and the properties of the data you are relying on. Well, the statistical agencies have to be very transparent and do things like publishing standard errors, investigating biases, etc. And you don't find those in other sources of information. All right. And right now we're at a period where we both have long-term trends that are a problem for the statistical agencies, and we have an administration that has embarked on a number of changes in the federal government that are having some pretty serious collateral damage for the agencies. And we'll be getting into that. So the next person to talk is Jacqueline, who's going to talk about some of the uses and the importance of federal employment data on a more granular basis. Jacqueline, you're on.
Thank you. So as Erica mentioned, my name is Jacqueline Kelly. I'm the director of NYC Labor Market Information Service, LMIS. We're an applied research center at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. Our distinction is we're the only New York City-based organization that's fully devoted to conducting mixed methods labor market research. So we use different kinds of data sources, like Erica was talking about. There's private, there's public, they're gathered from different sources. We use them all, and we gather our own data with the purpose of making our findings really usable in policy and applied program settings. So what I'm going to do is spend just a few minutes kind of laying the groundwork. I've looked at who's here today, and so I know that about half of you, maybe more, could actually give this level setting overview that I'm going to give. But just to make sure we're all on the same page as we get into some of the details in terms of what's happening, what the concerns are, what the losses might be, just to make sure that we're all coming from the same universe of understanding what are the data that we're talking about and what are some examples of how it can get used. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some key data sets similar to the ones that Erica's given an overview of, public, and then a few private ones that have come up when companies have access to private data. As Erica mentioned, there's benefits of this, but there's also some drawbacks in terms of really understanding what's underlying the analysis, both in terms of the analytic decisions, but also sometimes the motivation and the perspective. And then I'm going to give just a few examples of what this looks like in policymaking decisions and in program design. Okay, so before I get into the data sources themselves, as we do it, just a few things for you to be keeping in the back of your head. Are we talking about survey versus administrative data? The importance here, self-report. Are people be able to come up with answers they feel are an accurate representation? Do I and my neighbor understand things the same way? Maybe we report on something different, even though we think we're saying the same thing. And then also, we have larger issues of survey versus administrative data when we do get to some of those private data sources where it really is about what people feel like sharing. Another thing to think about as we move into these data sources is, what are they looking at? What are they analyzing? What's the level? Is it individuals? Is it the household? Is it a firm? So a company or a place of business? Is it a whole industry, like a group of companies focused on the same kind of product? Or is it a geography that includes all of those things, people, households, and firms? Another thing that distinguishes between these data sources is how often they're able to gather their data. And one of the things we see in public versus private is that private companies often just keep updating their data and bringing it in. What we see sometimes for publicly available data is that it's gathered maybe monthly, annually, or quarterly. It tends to be much more thorough and clean. So just something to also be thinking about is how often is this data being gathered? And then finally, public versus private, which I've gotten into a little, but I think will probably continue to come up over the course of our conversation today. Okay, so first I'm going to go over some of the data sets that Erica mentioned, just to give you an overview of what they are. So CPS, that's the current population survey. Erica gave you a brief overview. And I'm really glad, Erica, that you mentioned the response rates, because I don't have that here, but I know that Steve is also going to talk about how important that is and what some of the implications are as these response rates begin to decline. So CPS looks at people and households. It's a monthly national data collection effort. It looks at employment, unemployment, labor force participation. So that means you could be employed or you could be looking for a job. This would put you into labor force participation, even if you're not working right now. But then we have people who maybe aren't doing that right now. We have income, the type of job that people have, the industry, which would be kind of company, or occupation, sort of what they do in their daily tasks. Union membership, that's a great one. Worker characteristics, so level of education, for example. And then household characteristics. Nice thing about the CPS is, since it comes out monthly, on some months they will add addendums. So you can, during elections, they'll ask about voter behavior, or I think maybe in March they do something about insurance. So sometimes they do have little supplements that help us understand detailed things that aren't part of the general survey that's every month. JOLTS, Eric also mentioned, this is great. This looks at different kinds of job changes that have happened. So we have job openings in the private and public sector. I've italicized except in federal government for obvious reasons that might be important to people on this call. So this looks at demand and shortages. We also have hires, so people that are being brought in and added to payroll, and then separations. And this is important because we're able to distinguish between whether these are worker initiated or employer initiated. Worker initiated means workers are feeling very confident. I don't need to stick around this job I don't like. Off I go. I'm confident I'll be able to land something else. Employer initiated often suggests something else, maybe something going on with the economy. So these mean very different things, or they suggest very different things, even though they're both separations. And then other would be maybe a death, for example. Nobody initiated it by design. This is available at national and regional levels and also by industry. That's the type of firm, kind of company. We also have the QCEW, and this is industry data reported by employers. This is a key one because it draws on administrative data, which means, as Erica mentioned, we are really getting the full look at what's going on. We don't have to worry about response rates. We don't have to worry about whether people said quite what they mean. It does not draw on survey responses. So this is something that is used often for benchmarking. Comes out quarterly. And then finally, the current employment statistics survey, sometimes called payroll survey. And this is about jobs that are currently held. So think about JOLTS as jobs that are in movement. CES, what does employment look like? So that's monthly estimates at national and state level. Employment, how many hours people are working, how much they're earning, the size of firms. So small companies versus large companies, what distinctions might be there. And that's a little smaller, as Erica mentioned, than QCW, but it's available quite quickly. Okay, so you can see that we can get quite a bit of information at the national level at a pretty regular basis, and that there's a lot of work going into thinking about if it's going to be survey, is there a way to make it representative, definitions. These are data products that hang together. They're intended to be complementary. Okay, now I want to talk just briefly about some other ones that come from the private sector. You've probably heard of some of these. So LinkedIn, Indeed, these are companies that, among other things, host job ads. LinkedIn, of course, does resumes. So what they're doing is drawing on the data that essentially their clients post to analyze that and come up with different employment and labor market trends based on that. And what that gives us is both quantitative data, but also some more texture to that to understand how are employers talking about skills, for example. Lightcast is a private company that scrapes job ads, and then they've added some publicly available data recently. But where their claim to fame is scraping job ads. And that is incredibly helpful as a complement to some of these publicly available data sources we looked at that talk about what's going on with work and efforts to hire and openings. Lightcast will tell you this kind of employer is looking for this kind of skill. And then ADP, you may also have heard of this is monthly, and it's payroll, private sector only. This is of high interest to people because it comes out very fast. So these are great in that they provide additional information to the publicly available data sets. But I do want to just flag a few things that I alluded to earlier. You've got to think about the representativeness of the sample when you are looking at private data. They are not working to figure out whether they've got a representative sample of the United States population or of a city. What they're doing is saying, we're looking at our clients. So for LinkedIn, for example, if we were going to say, what's the profile of a person on LinkedIn? And I would say, 70% of them have a bachelor's degree. We could not extend that to say 70% of New Yorkers do, for example, because the people who participate in LinkedIn, there's no reason to think they're representative of New Yorkers overall, right? And so same thing when you think about, let's think about Lightcast, for example. if we're looking at job ads, and Lightcast says, all right, 90% of jobs pay at least $50,000. You're like, oh, okay, that's good news. And then ask yourself, am I sure that when employers post a job ad, it's a really good, accurate representation of the job? Or is it possible? Maybe it's off in some ways. So when we look at private data sets that are privately held, that draw on clients that have not committed to sort of transparency and analytics, to raw data, to comparable definitions, are they neutral? You have to be thoughtful about what you can infer from them, right? Whereas when you're looking at the publicly available data sets, they exist to help you be responsible in what you infer and how you use it. So this is not to disparage either. They're great and they're powerful. They're big and they're powerful. But to just bring the mindset, a sort of a critical mindset to these private ones when you use them. Okay. I don't want to go over my time. But if you have questions later, I'm happy to go into some of those caveats more. So then I want to just talk briefly about these data sets and how they get used. So they are used in federal policy making in a lot of ways, but just a couple examples. The Federal Reserve will use them to determine interest rates and to think about inflation, which is something we're hearing about quite a bit. For example, the CES and the CPS surveys that we just talked about. They will look at that data to help inform what's going to happen with inflation, what's going on with unemployment, what about interest rates? Tax credits and subsidies. These can be adjusted using income distribution data. Again, looking at overall, like the CPS, like we talked about, to understand, okay, what's going on at the household, at the individual level? What does that look like in the country? Do we need to use a economic policy intervention? And what data can we draw on to know that we're making a decision that's reliable and that's based on fact? And then QCW can be very helpful because remember, it's not self-report. We're not worried about whether somebody got around to participating. We're not worried about whether the data are skewed. QCW is administrative unemployment insurance data. We need to understand what's going on with counties, what's going on with industries in terms of layoff or economic downturns to help guide targeted government interventions. We can use that data to understand what comparisons look like. And then I want to just give a couple examples because I think sometimes, at least in what my observation is, that because the publicly available data are large and they can be a little complex because they have some of them almost a century of thought that's gone into them and the variables and the definitions, that sometimes people can be a little bit scared off from using them instead of just going to some of these private ones that are cool and big and have a lot of invested in front end, but maybe don't have that rigor. So I want to just give a few examples of how LMIS has used some of this publicly available data in a few different projects that we did and why it was so important. So DC 37 is the largest public sector union in New York City. And we worked with them to think about career paths for their members and why and what the kind of value add of being in a union was. And so for that, one of the things we looked at was worker characteristics. So remember, that comes from the current population survey. And that helped us understand what goes on in this country versus what goes on in this city. And what do workers in these different trades typically have in terms of credentials? And what does that mean that DC 37 should be thinking about as they support their workers in having the right kind of credentials to grow in different career paths? Another project we're working on is New York City's Department of Veterans Services. So while DC 37 was looking at, let's make sure our workers are prepared, the Department of Veterans Services, so New York City's is one of the only city level Department of Veterans Services. Most are state or federal. And they really wanted to understand, are we doing a good job by our vets? Are we giving them the resources and the right kind of supports to help them thrive? So you can look at vets in New York City versus the typical New Yorker. And you can use some data to do that and say, well, how are the vets doing relative to New Yorkers? But you might also want to be able to understand, how are vets in New York City doing compared to vets across the country, right? Because that also is a very important way to determine whether or not DVS can say, we're doing a great job, send the vets to us, we're ready to help them thrive. So for us, the federal data, looking at people who had participated in military service, really helped us be able to help the Department of Veteran Services understand, here's where you're really doing a good job in terms of employment, in terms of insurance, in terms of wages, in terms of training. And here's where when vets come to New York City, they just are still struggling. And then one last example, New York City Public Schools. We were brought in to help prepare sort of career pathways for students, not to tell them what to do, but to give them all the information as they begin planning their own pathway. And we did some focus groups, and we had been looking at it very New York City centric. And the young people said to us, absolutely not. We really want to understand what's out there. Is it good to stay in New York? We kind of want to leave. And so having this publicly available data that we knew was unbiased. This did not come from a private sector company trying to convince people to move to Austin. We were able to look at this national data and say, well, this is what it would look like if you go out into the world. These are the credentials you should think about getting. If you stay in New York City, this is what it looks like instead. So I'm going to stop there, but just to say there's a lot of ways that this gets used, both at the macro level by policy making that affects both the country and states and regions within it, but also very much at the programmatic level locally, helping to make good choices for different kinds of communities. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, next we have Steve Pearson talking about threats to the data that you see are so important for so many reasons. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Erica, and thanks to Kara for this invitation. I'm honored to be on this panel and appreciate you all attending. I'm going to be zooming out and looking more at the health of all of the federal fiscal agencies, which I started looking at with a team who's listed here. And we started, well, Jonathan and I actually started almost 3 years ago, and the project formally started about 2.5 years ago to assess the health of federal fiscal agencies. And so, and we're supported by the Sloan Foundation, Annie Casey Foundation, and the California Community Foundation. And what I'll structure this talk is just basically what did we find in terms of the health of federal agency last year, and then how has that changed this year with the rapid changes underway. And I'm actually going to go back up and just say the bridge is here for the reason that Anne said, and also Erica, that we really see the federal fiscal agencies as the backbone of the U.S. data infrastructure, and that we've used that theme, we think, pretty effectively, or that it's been effective with the Hill. Near the end, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges for federal statistical agencies on the Hill. And then if there's time, I'll talk about ways to contribute. And I just want to start my timer here. So we issued our inaugural report in July of last year. The U.S. federal statistical system is very broad, highly decentralized, and so we focused on the 13 principal agencies, as well as the U.S. Statistician's Office, the Chief Statistician's Office. And our basic question is, do they have the support they need to continue their missions into the 21st century? So we wanted to be forward-looking, and we want to do this annually. Our report is here at the bit.ly in the lower right, Nation's Data at Risk. And we basically asked 6 questions, but I'm going to boil this down to 1 for the purpose of this presentation, and really encapsulates well our first year. Is the agency able to produce relevant and timely statistics? Which is a very challenging issue, right? Because what is relevant and timely is always changing. And so it requires constant innovation by the agencies to update their existing products or maybe create new products. And that, we believe, requires support in 3 necessary areas: necessary, not necessarily sufficient. Professional autonomy refers to the ability to control all of your decisions around collecting, analyzing, and disseminating that information so that you can withstand any improper influence. It requires parent agency support because these agencies need, human resources or legal or security or any number of amount of support from their parent agency, including during the budget process. And then, of course, it requires funds and people. So those are the three critical areas. And we wanted to take into account the headwinds that the agencies see. We've already talked about declining response rates, but I'll mention again that just the changing situations that are being measured, as well as demanding the demands of data users. And what we found, I'm going to whiz through this, is that many of these agencies have a highly innovative culture, but their innovation capacity can be restricted by a number of things. In particular, we found that all of the agencies have a significant weakness in at least one of the three critical support areas that we identified. Already talked about some of the budget. So, the BLS budget is down some 18% in purchasing power since FY09. And that, being down at least 14% is true for the majority of those 13 agencies. And that impedes their ability to innovate and modernize. And Erica has already mentioned the current population survey. Last summer, they announced that they would have to cut the sample size. That may have been stayed due to the work of Erica and her successor, Bill Beach, and the Friends of BLS. I think that remains to be seen depending upon what happens in the final FY25, but they did great work there. But it's kind of these longer running series that are especially at risk because you've got to be innovating while maintaining the old measure, and you want to have continuity, and that's really hard versus just kind of creating a new product. We've already talked about declining response rates that makes it very challenging. You need to diversify your data sources. And so here's an image just of the declining response rates. We found that the chief statistician's office does great work, but they do it with only 8 statistical policy staff. So they are under resourced, but also could be empowered as well. And this is going to be my last slide about what we found in terms of we rated the supports for these three agencies. I'm sorry, for these three categories for all of the agencies. And in terms of funding, it's challenging for all of them. And that's probably true for a lot of the federal government. And then in terms of professional autonomy, it's generally also challenging, but less so than resources. And then parent agency was better. For BLS, they're especially challenged for their resources, not so bad for professional autonomy, and pretty good for parent agency support as of last summer. We'll see where this administration comes out. And then we had 15 recommendations, and I'm going to just keep going because I want to talk about what we're seeing currently. And so we did kind of a very sharp right turn in January with this administration and the rapid changes. And so we're posting the updates that we are seeing kind of as an aggregator, consolidator at this bit.ly, FedStat monitoring. The 5 situations we're most closely watching are listed there, discussed at that website. And so I'm going to move on. As Erica already mentioned, yes, there's been damage. Fortunately, it seems to be all collateral damage in 4 or 5 areas. Loss of people, the contracts, some loss of leadership across the federal fiscal agencies. Advisory committees are gone, notably the 2 for BLS, also the other 2 for the economic federal fiscal agencies. One is the Federal Economic Statistical Advisory Committee, and the other one is the BEA Advisory Committee, as well as some data resources. That staff loss for these 13 agencies ranges from 0 to 95. The National Center for Education Statistics is the one that is down to 3 staff, especially devastated, but others are impacted too. They're really pushing the deferred resignation program, early retirement, and people, morale is low, and so people are taking that. And then in terms of where we are today, I think there's been a bit of a lull in effects, but it doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of kind of damage being done. I think the biggest one is just around the further reductions in staff. People are taking these departures. As of a week or two ago, I think BLS was down some 10 to 15%, but we expect more as people take the early retirement or departure early separation packages. And BLS doesn't know where those are going to happen, so it's really hard to plan for it. So it's kind of like how this impacts BLS and the other agencies remains to be seen. We're always stressing in our meetings that these agencies' work are highly labor intensive, expertise intensive, experience intensive. So it's very likely that cuts in employees will mean cutbacks or cuts in some of the products. They're now starting to implement the schedule, what had been Schedule F, where employees are serving more at will, can be more easily dismissed. That's especially concerning for federal statistical agencies because it introduces a lever for improper influence. And I know that Erica has a something coming out on that. But there's also they don't know their FY25 budget for sure. There could be organization, and then there's the wild card. What else is going to happen? So lots of uncertainty and concern. I'm often thinking about why is it so hard to advocate for the agencies? And so I want to just make clear I'm changing hats here. All of our advocacy that the ASA does is not with supported foundations. That is, they do not support advocacy, but we were doing advocacy before this happened, and we do it separately. And we have a very compelling message for statistics, right? And it kind of goes back to what Erica already said, that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so what's the problem? And it goes back to what Anne already said of government statistics are a public good, which to me means it's supported by all but championed by few. I think there's also really a lack of awareness around the resources needed to do these federal statistics, and just really appreciate what goes into it. I also believe the appropriations process really disadvantages statistical agencies because it's a public good. And in many ways, what gets plussed up or, not cut as much is a popularity game. So if you've ever been in a congressional building in March or April, it is a madhouse. You name the special interest group and they are there advocating for their interest. And that just doesn't happen for federal statistics. Often in the meetings that I'm a part of, it might be the only meeting on a federal statistical agency that staffer is going to have. So we're really disadvantaged. It's obviously very competitive to get the funding. And then, modernization doesn't sell. So you've got to find other messages, which we have. But really, what a lot of these agencies need is the modernization. So it requires creativity and just awareness of what they need. And I think also political expediency is the default. In what Congress is going to do, what is the easiest thing for them to do? And that means generally not asking for input from the statistical community about what would be good for federal statistical agencies. So I think that is a major issue. I already mentioned the lack of awareness, and I'm at time. So there's many ideas that I think our group actually has for how you can be helpful. And so I'll just quickly summarize with showing our URL again. There's my email address, and I'll stop my presentation there.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to now talk myself for a little while. We've been mentioning modernization, so I want to just talk a little bit about what modernization means. So you've seen this. This is just a slide of the declining response rates. Right? These are all BLS surveys, and you can see that in the past 10 years, they have all drifted down. They had some effect of the pandemic from which there's been recovery, but certainly these trends have not been reversed. So I want to put this in a big historical context. So remember, BLS started out in 1884, the first independent statistical agency in the country. And at that point, we really didn't have a lot of statistics was just being born as an academic field. And so the products that were produced were much better than having no information, but they were all what's called politely convenience samples. You get the information where you can and you put that out because it's better than nothing. And there was no way to judge how good it was and no sense of really how to improve it other than just getting more of it. And then in the mid-1900s, we really had the development largely, or very important, contributed very importantly to by the statistical agencies themselves in developing modern statistical and survey methodology. So designing the samples, reporting, being able to calculate standard errors and biases, and so really being able to communicate in a transparent way the quality of the data. And the statistical agencies really forged ahead. Whatever you wanted to measure, they had a survey methodology to go after it. And at the beginning of that time, all the federal surveys were pretty much the only game in town. They were new and trust in government was higher. Those response rates were great. Okay. There was certainly some use of administrative data, particularly as a sample frame, but the real focus has been, from the mid-1900s to early 2000s on surveys. Now, so that was 1.0 was convenience samples, 2.0 surveys dominate. We are now entering into stats 3.0. And that's starting off with the threats to the surveys. So we have survey fatigue. Now there are a million surveys out there, not just the federal ones. And there are increased security and privacy concerns. There's less trust in government. And so these low survey response rates have raised costs and eroded reliability. So what is Stats 3.0 from a positive point of view? Well, we have a huge opportunity out there that there's this big data explosion. So we have digitized operations throughout the economy. We have cheap, powerful computers. We have internet connectivity. We've got novel software, AI, all this. So we can do much more. There's more data out there and we can do much more with it. This is an opportunity for the statistical agencies to create new products, but it's a new world. And so they in some ways, they've got to go back to some of the issues with Stats 1.0. These are essentially all different kinds of convenience samples. They are flawed, they're incomplete, they're inconsistent, they're siloed. There's good information in them, but you need to develop the techniques and to be able to create the quality of information with that set of inputs as you had with the designed surveys, right? So the Stats 3.0 solution is to create brand new blended data products that combine multiple sources to overcome the limitations of each one of them, and also then to promote the quality of that underlying data through and interoperability by going back and making the input data better. So that means data standards and having ways of saying, well, and I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay. So there is a report done by the Committee on National Statistics of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that lays all this out in much more, in a lot of glory and detail, and says, okay, this is what we need to head to. And data standards are part of this. the idea is that we're in the information age. What does that mean? Information is this commodity that's widely disseminated, and we can disseminate it much better if it's more standardized. So we want to essentially make administrative a little bit more like surveys, interoperable, designed for the measurement purposes that we have in mind. This will lower burden on respondents and collectors, and then so people generating the data will have actually a lower burden when they report it too. So to give you an example from a labor market standpoint, we talked about the QCEW, how it covers everybody, but it only has a few fields. And we want to get more information from these employers, but we can't impose upon all of them a huge burden, because that's that won't fly. So right now we have a crazy system where employers do have to report information on their employees on a fairly regular basis. And if you're a large employer, you could easily be reporting to 175 different government agencies, but fairly similar information. So you have all your 11 million employers up there. You're sending different parts of that information to different collectors. And then you have, which are all these government agencies. And then there are all these different uses down there. And this is a mess. All right. We could have something that looks more like this. Right? Where you have standard-based architectures, designed information that they're all keeping together, and this protects confidentiality and promotes interoperability at the same time. There's an initiative for this, JetX. I don't want to dwell on that in particular, but this gives you the idea of the role that the statistical system can play and how everybody can benefit from it. So probably to do this, we need a consolidated statistical system. Right now, we've got 13 principal statistical agencies, over 100 statistical units that are operating under cabinet members, right? And modernization requires that we bring in economies of scale, that they can share data, that they can coordinate and prioritize, and that they can together preserve trust, which ensures that the statistical system, having modernization then can build in systems that preserve the trust by ensuring that the statistical system operates outside of undue influences on their methodology. This has been proposed by a number of previous administrations, and maybe now's the time, because there's, if nothing else, certainly this administration is quite bold, right? And we know that the threats to trust are very high, and the need for modernization is getting more critical every year. So that's kind of taking us to the precipice of where we need to go. But there is another issue out there, which is at the same time that we're talking about the importance of all of this information, people don't trust that it's still going to be available to them. And so we have with us Wendy Kozlowski, who's going to talk about the efforts to make sure that the data that we have are backed up. So Wendy, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Erica. Thank you all for inviting me to be here and speak today. I have really learned a tremendous amount from my colleagues here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. As Erica mentioned, I'm going to speak to a slightly different piece of this. Just a second here. And many people consider this, or it may be helpful for you to think about it as kind of the end point of all this. Once the the survey data, the information that that has been talked about thus far has been produced, it has been collected, it has been analyzed, the products have been made. What comes after that? How do people get access to it? How do they find it? And what is going on kind of under the hood when it comes to preserving and maintaining that access to it? And I'm going to really approach that from two standpoints to start with, and that's one is if you are wanting to find data that you know is not where you expect it to be anymore, what are some of the steps that you can take to find that? And alternately, if you're not quite to that point yet, but you feel that you are working with data that might be at risk and is at a danger, or you feel that there's a possibility that will go away, what are some practical steps that you can take to ensure continued access to that? And I want to also specifically mention that in the content that I'm talking about, I know, Jacqueline, you mentioned some private data as well. The examples that I'm going to use right now are specifically public federal data. When you are talking about data that is provided from the private sector, data that may have restrictions or use limitations to it, those all kind of fall under different policies and practices for use and preservation. And I'm not going to get into that today, that there are certainly experts that are available to talk with you about that. So let's get into that finding part. So there are a lot of efforts going on, particularly in the last 4 months, but there's also a lot that have been going on longer than that around maintaining long-term access to this. So if you find that the data is not where you expect it to be when you want to go use it, there's a lot of places to start. This is not a comprehensive list, but to give you some ideas, there is an effort that is an aggregation of a number of different organizations, including the Research Data and Access and Preservation organization, the iAssist organization, the Data Curation Network, and many others, called the Data Rescue Project. They maintain an aggregated list of data sets that they know to have had backup efforts made on them. And those data sets, once backed up, are being pulled into this crowdsourced repository housed at ICPSR called Data Lumos, and are then made publicly available again off of the original federal government data websites. So that is a really good place to start for some of these federal data sets. If the data was originating from a website-based platform, many of you have probably heard of the Wayback Machine or the Internet Archive. There are collections within the Internet Archive, in particular one called the End of Term Archive. This is not new to the current administration shift. The Internet Archive has been collecting information around administration shifts since the Bush to Obama transition. But again, there is an acute sense of the need for this now. So you can go look in the Wayback Machine. And this is particularly useful if you already know the URL of what you're looking for. If you have a very specific need, going into Internet Archive and finding it could be something that is useful. Of course, it is dependent on the complexity of the data set. We'll get into that in just a minute. There are lots of other places. For example, Harvard Law School has undertaken effort and has created a full archive of data sets on data.gov. There are many, many places to look. And so there are also now starting to be places that are aggregating these various different archive data sets, such as this one out of Boston University called Find Lost Data. And that allows you to search across these databases if you know specific data sets that you're looking for. The archiving and library community has been collecting a lot of information about this. You may be able to find it if you're associated with an academic institution or have access to websites. Many of these are public. A great one is coming out of the University of Minnesota. They have a guide to finding government information during the 2025 academic transition. And like I said, there are many, many others. The Roper Center collects survey data. The Open Energy Data Initiative is backing up Department of Energy data. Lots of different places to look for data that you aren't finding in its expected home. And we take that from the other standpoint before it gets actually lost. I don't really like to use that word. I hope that we're not losing permanently any of this information, but I try to remain optimistic. But what if you have data that you are concerned about losing? So there's some very practical steps, again, that I would encourage you to think about taking. First, take a look at what it is that you're looking for, and what you do depends a little bit on what you're looking for. I already mentioned the differences between just going and grabbing, for example, a document that contains information, or a spreadsheet, or a single file, or a couple files. Is going to be much easier than trying to collect data that is embedded from a database and may require specific queries or APIs to access. If it is web-based, interactions with that website, whether it's static or requires you to have input to it, is going to impact how well things like Internet Archive are able to crawl and collect that underlying information. And then there are specific places and things that you would want to consider if you're looking for backing up code or software. But I encourage you to go back to those first few resources that were listed and first see if anybody else has already collected this data. What we, as librarians, don't want to end up with, we like to have multiple copies of things, but we don't need millions of copies that actually end up in people's closets underneath their desks and don't end up being usable by others. So see if somebody else has already collected it outside of the government websites and have created an archive. And if they haven't, you don't think they have, many of those sites that I already pointed to give an interface to allow you to suggest data sets to be archived via their platforms. And there's a few links on this slide here for that. The Data Rescue Project is a really great aggregated summary of these resources for you. So the next step would be, if it isn't already collected and you want to consider making a local download copy of it yourself. You think about how complex the data sets. I already talked about that, the impact of how large they are. Some of these data sets are gigabytes, terabytes. Do you really have local storage to maintain and collect that, hold that kind of information for the long term? And of course, I already mentioned the impacts of different kinds of restrictions on them. So, keep that all in mind. If you want to download it yourself, there's a lot of great information out there. There's a guide from MIT. They have a checklist for federal data backups for you to use. The Data Curation Network has a set of steps modified from their curation protocols for data rescue. If you're looking at code or script-based downloads, University of Washington has a GitHub site providing guidance on data rescue. Once you have gathered the data, once you have collected your own copy, I would strongly encourage you not to hide it under your desk. See if you can find a place that would push it out and let others use it as well. And there are, as I've said a couple of times already, there's a lot of people thinking about this already. So don't hesitate to reach out. There are people, experts. I am not an archivist, but I do consider myself a data professional. If, for example, you come to us at Cornell, we can't help you. We will help you find someone who can. At Cornell, we have a group called Cornell Data Services. You're welcome to reach out to us. We can also help you connect, if you're at different places, to peers who may have more disciplinary or geographic expertise for what you're looking at. But I want to take the next couple of minutes to dig into an example. I talked about the importance of not just downloading the data set, that you have to have context. And you're going to hear a lot of themes right now that have already been mentioned by Erica and Jacqueline and Steve that are going to be echoed in this last little piece about preservation and access. So Erica talked about the provenance of the actual collection. Now I'm talking about the provenance of the archival of this information. How can we ensure that the digital record that you are accessing is what it is that Steve and Jacqueline and Erica have already talked about? So when you are going and downloading data yourself, if you get to the point that you do that, here is an incomplete list that will give you an idea of the kind of context that you need to capture. So of course, you're going to get a file name. but that may not actually be reflective of the data set title. So make sure you record both of those pieces of information. Record where you're getting it from, not just the name of the agency or organization, but the actual URL, so you can go back and trace back where that data came from. I already talked about making sure you're tracking licensing or restrictions, and I mentioned that this is specifically addressing public data, but even public data can have different levels of licensing and reuse suggestions. Can someone properly cite the original source? Make sure that you get the information that's needed to do that. When did you download it? When was it changed? What kind of methodology did you use to actually download it? Were there specific scripts or API calls that were used? Oops, I just went the wrong way there. And take a record of what tools or apps that you actually needed to download the data. So 2 real quick use cases. I wish now I had been a little bit more careful and grabbed the actual example from CPS or JOLTS or something like that. But this morning I went in actually and tried to grab to give you some examples of what I mean of the nuances and the challenges that are involved in actually grabbing these data and the kind of things that are captured by our systems that we might not even think about. So the BLS has a great, in addition to their kind of really user-friendly interface where you can grab data sets and visualize them online, they also provide downloads of bundles of their data sets where you can grab these tarred GZ bundles of their data, and it makes it really easy to get the information you need. Once you open those, so I did that, for example, I just grabbed the very first one at the top here. When I open that file, it looks like it opens fine. I know nothing about this data. I'm a marine ecologist. However, it was a CSV file. You can see at the top, it actually didn't even have an extension on it, but it was a comma separated variable file. But there's no context to this. If you were to scroll down in that screenshot that I have on the left, at the very bottom of that list, there is actually a collection of README files. So just downloading the data files themselves is not enough. You need to make sure that you're grabbing the context. So not just you can understand it, but others can understand it too. And it wouldn't necessarily be intuitive to you to do that. I will also say I acknowledge the fact that it is unlikely that someone would be going in and grabbing a single one of these data sets to archive. It would probably be more systematic, but perhaps there are use cases, and this is really just to exemplify these subtle differences. So the second example is if I was to go in and get this same kind of information off the Internet Archive. The image on the left is a screenshot from this morning's view of the bls.gov/data page. And you can go in and you can click on any of those little icons, and I could grab a table from a particular data set of interest. So I went into the Wayback Machine and I looked for these data sets. And you can see them in the most recent web scrape of this data set, which was April 11th. There are some differences, right? You can see that this little special notice doesn't exist on the most recent Internet Archive version of it. And that's actually about a 2-week period where there was a mistake in the data set in late 2023. For some reason, the Internet Archive version of it didn't grab it. So be very aware of kind of little differences that come in. I went down to the payroll section of this particular collection of data sets, and I downloaded a single file. So this was from the modeled wage estimates data set, and it didn't have any README. There was no place for me to grab. If you can see in these little icons, there's no little README or documentation that was obvious for me to download. But in this particular data set, this was an Excel file, and it has separate tab where the information, the documentation that I needed to understand this data set was embedded in the file itself. So there's a lot of variability that is needed to understand, to be able to capture everything that we need in these data sets when archiving and preserve and doing justice to the massive amount of work that you have all done to create the data sets in the first place. I want to close by backing out just a little bit then and thinking, as we head into the discussion part, about our systems. And we've already talked about the many aspects of which we probably are working within a fragile system. So what is it that we can do to make them better? Erica talked about the infrastructure needed to collect. What about the infrastructure that we're using to actually access and preserve it, both the user facing and the underlying architecture that we're using? Are we creating mirrored sites? How are we keeping how are we minimizing risk while making those available to have others have access to it? When changes are being made to these data sets, how are we tracking those? Not just whether they're absolute takedowns, as we've seen, of data sets, but alterations of them, and how does that impact how we go about addressing that in our system? And of course, who should be doing it and how are we paying for it? What kind of collaborations? There have been some really effective collaborations that have come out of the data rescue project about bringing in all the different pieces of expertise that's needed to preserve these data sets. How can we facilitate that? And Steve, you talked about this. How can we, as the different professionals that are required throughout this entire sphere of what it takes to generate and maintain these data sets, how do we advocate? How can we become really good storytellers of why the data are available, like you're doing, Jacqueline? You mentioned, Erica, there's lots of uses that we might not originally envision for the data that we collect that is different from their original intent. And you all have talked about the importance of transparency and trust. And I think that that also transfers not just to the collection of this data and the use of the data, but also into this last little piece about preservation and archiving. And that's all I have.
Thank you. All right, so we have about 20 some odd minutes for both just chatting amongst ourselves and then talking about some of the questions raised by the audience. So let me start. Yes. So let me start by just maybe asking, let me start with asking about what are your biggest worries about the federal data system in the near term and also in the long run? And I guess I'll start with Jacqueline, and then we can all chime in.
Okay. I think for me, the biggest worries, and this comes from two parts. One is as a academic who uses this in my work, but also as an American. I think that my concerns are, one, will we have the data? Because if we don't have federal level data, it becomes very hard to make sense of what the needs are of the people who live in the country and how that varies based on the kind of person and where they are. But I think my other issue is that even if we continue to be able to have the data system, can we count on the confidentiality of the data? Right now, data, as probably most of you know, there's a lot of steps in place for federal data to make sure that it remains confidential, both at the individual level, but also at the enterprise level. And if confidentiality becomes difficult to assure, I think that will further harm people and enterprises' willingness to be candid in their response, which of course completely undermines the purpose and the utility of the data, but also could anonymized or unconfidential data really be weaponized in ways that are very counter to the purpose. So I would say those are my two fairly existential fears about federal data. Hope that doesn't give everybody nightmares.
It's hard for me to do just one, but I think, worrying about the objectivity of the data going forward, because it's, as has been said, trust is critical for the federal agencies because they need to rely on data from other people. If you don't trust the agency, you're not going to get that, and then it just goes into an awful spiral. More near term, I'm just worried about what products will be cut. What are we going to lose? Hopefully it's minimal. And the third thing I'm going to mention to that question, Erica, is just, okay, if we lose something, what if nobody speaks up? What if there's not an uproar? which will just signal that, okay, that maybe there are data sources that we don't really need anymore. But I'm more so I'm more worried about the ones that are critical, and if we don't speak up, then those could be irreversibly gone.
Mhm. Wendy, you have something to add?
I guess I don't know how different it is, but I want to reiterate this point around trust. I know that you've all mentioned it, and I think that in the archival and preservation community, that is also part of our responsibility in thinking about. There are a lot of questions about trust right now in many aspects, and what it is that we can do to facilitate that. And that dynamic seems to be changing really rapidly. So I guess if we get back to your original question, what scares me is how can we adapt quickly enough to maintain the trust in all the different pieces of our system, and how do we communicate that back out? This is public data, and different people consume things in different ways, and the value is different to different people. So we have to communicate that trust in so many different ways. Are we going to be able to do that as a community of stewards of this data? And I guess I don't know that it scares me, but it's definitely something that is on my mind.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just throw in, I worry, having been in a statistical agency and seen the amazing expertise that they have there, that we are going to be losing that in a way that's going to be very difficult to recover from. And that's not to say that I don't worry about everything else mentioned. Okay. Another thing that I think, yeah, there are two kind of different questions, somewhat related. What are the signs that things are going downhill that we should be watching out for? And then after that, like, what happens to the, if this really goes downhill, what is the impact on all of us because of this, right? So talk about some signs that you'd be looking out for. I've got my own list. Anybody want to jump in on some signs? All right, I'll start. Disappearing programs, disappearing data. You could have more mistakes made by the agencies, so more corrections that have to be issued. You could have things that do not come out on time. You could have loss of detail. So if sample size cuts or response rates keep going down, then all of a sudden you're not getting the granularity that you want by geography or by demographic group or something, because the data don't support it anymore, right? And slowing down of innovations. And then there are signs of interference. So suppose news releases are delayed or speeded up for political reasons, right? You could have injection of spin into release narratives. So it's no longer 6 ounces of fluid in a 12-ounce glass, but it's a great day for America. Or something like that, which does not belong in a statistical right? Implementation of certain measures that would be really difficult for the statistical agencies to deal with would be something like this Schedule PC policy career, which essentially converts the top leadership of the agency into something like political appointees, where they can be fired at will because they are seen as running counter to the policy of the administration. So inflation rises rapidly, unemployment drops, unemployment rises. Schedule PC applies to people who have jobs that are policy influencing. Well, data is intended to be policy influencing, right? So are all of the senior people in statistical agencies now going to be classified so that they can be fired if the and it would be the the president's responsibility to decide who would be reclassified. Could they be fired because the outcome was not pleasing to the White House? I think that that's very worrisome. And then there's improper use of or access to pre-release information. So again, these are things that I worry about. I'm gonna say
Erica, I'd like to comment just
Yeah.
quickly on that. And I wish I could say I was going to say all the same things as you, because that was a really great comprehensive list. For our project, we want to kind of track some of these things, but given the number of federal statistical products, there's just so much one could go into. And so I want to jump in and say, if you are aware of any of these things that Erica has just gone through, please, get in contact with us, share it with us so that we can also try to make others aware of it. We're working or thinking about ways to do this more methodically, but for now, I just want to echo Erica and ask for you all to make us aware of any changes that you see, like those that Erica mentioned.
We had a question from the audience. One is there an incentive for individuals and businesses to respond? And the answer is pretty simple. In most cases, no. It's simply a public service that people are asked to perform. So people or businesses are told that it's very important, and they're encouraged to report. But in most cases, it's purely voluntary. And then another question, if you put your evil hat on and we're going to use data for nefarious purposes, what would you do? And what are the worst cases that we could worry about? Well, you could trade in financial terms. You could trade on information before it was released. The employment situation every month moves the market more than anything else. These days, the inflation report is up there because we have inflation worries. If you had access to that pre-release information, you or your family, your friends could probably make a lot of money. But you could also try and manipulate it. And other countries have this has happened in other countries. Argentina stands out. Greece as well. So, and then people don't trust the data. Okay.
I'm just going to add something
Yeah.
there, and that's not exactly about how you would use the data, but coming back to your previous question, and if I put my nefarious hat on, thinking about if the data become unavailable or some of these statistical programs are closed down, some of the policy examples that I gave earlier about how these data sets are used to inform economic policy to help the government make decisions about where to put resources, you start to ask yourself, in the absence of turning to data, what would be the determinant of how decisions got made? And you start really thinking about political favors, advocacy organizations, and cities, interest groups that have the funds to send lobbyists. And I think that's really where you get into like a very dangerous situation, particularly in a capitalist society.
And even without that, you just have more people making guesses instead of informed decisions, right? And so we have stranded human capital, people who couldn't get jobs that could perform them. We could have lower returns on investments and capital, right? so a lower standard of living, we'd have an increase in conflict because people, again, wouldn't be able to reach agreement because they would see different truths out there. So all of those things would lower productivity and lower outcomes for the country as a whole, our economic vitality. Let me just close by maybe each of us saying what do you think, what do you really want our audience to take away from this conversation? And maybe I will start with Jacqueline.
I think if I was going to distill down what I would like to leave folks with, it's that these data sources that are publicly available and that are designed and the data collected and analyzed by, I say this generously, technocrats, they are irreplaceable. Once they go down, once they are undermined and gutted, there is nothing else that is going to be able to give the same kind of objective, public interest and public good oriented information and insight. So it's really crucial that we not say, oh, the private sector will step in. The private sector is not for the public good. It's got lots of great stuff, but that's not what it's there for. And so just to say, like, these really are crucial and they are unique.
Wendy?
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about since I was asked to talk with you all about this is how valuable it's been to me to remember that I'm not working in a vacuum on any of the stuff that we do. That I think about the people that are sitting in this room and that are in this webinar. Let's be sure to share our expertise and think about it not in isolation, but think about it together. I think about the magnificent things that are being done within the archivist and library community towards preservation and access, and the utility of conversing with all our users to respond appropriately to the things that are happening, not in isolation of one another, but together.
Steve?
I will second of just making people aware of this issue. I mean, clearly you all are committed to this, and the risks, the value are, really undervalued generally. I'll quickly share that we met with a key staffer for a Senate committee that covered labor, and their question to us was, how do we get the response rates back up? I mean, we need to do education at a level like this. We know that we have to go to other data sources, but you can be sharing it not just with staffers in Congress, but with through LinkedIn. Maybe you've got colleagues in the business sector. I think just helping to spread the word, helping to share the your awareness of what the value and what goes into these products.
Those are all great things. I would say join and support advocacy groups, so ASA, but whatever group you belong to, calling their attention to the dependence on data and asking, seeing how that group can help support the statistical system is important. Reporting issues to the ASA and other places so that they can keep track of things. And then use your social media presence, use your trusted voice, every opportunity you can to call attention to the fragility and the importance of the system. And signing those funding letters, do it, because actually quantity matters and most people don't take the minute to sign their name to them, and it makes a difference. So those are, and if you have relationship with any kind of legislator, and if your company that you work for does any lobbying, they should be lobbying for this as well, not just reducing taxation and regulation. Well, I think that we're done, but thank you so much to our panelists and to Cornell Caro for giving us this opportunity, and of course to all of our audience. we look forward to comments and reactions and to your activism going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to meet you.